Okay, so I recently read The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey, which is a book that's been on my radar for a long time and a lot of people talk about it. I finally got around to reading it and it is wonderful. But before I dig into the book and why I like it so much, I need to talk about the egg on my face. M.R. Carey is Mike Carey. And I didn't know that until I started reading the book and I had a quick check online and read his wiki page. M.R. Carey is Mike Carey. If you don't know who Mike Carey is, I used to be an enormous comic book fan and collector, and he was one of my favourite comic book writers. He wrote Lucifer, he wrote a bunch of stuff for Marvel and DC, and most importantly, he wrote The Unwritten, one of my favourite comic books I've ever read. It is a fascinating and intricate exploration of literature itself and our relationship to it. It is psychologically fascinating, it is dense, it is beautiful, and because it's a comic book, it uses the medium to its advantage to explore the boundaries in a mystical way between fact and fiction, between real life and fictional worlds. I love The Unwritten so much, and I didn't realize this is the same guy. Another reason I read this now is that I have his next book, a big sci-fi epic called Infinity Gate, just behind me. I have a review copy of it. It's coming out soon, and I'm going to read and review it. So I thought, right, I need to finally get to this. This was his first novel, as far as I understand, and it is called The Girl with All the Gifts, which is a reference to Pandora. The name Pandora means the girl with all the gifts. That's explained in the novel, and I was really grateful for that explanation. They just started doing roadworks outside. I don't know if you can hear that, but I have to keep filming. I've got stuff to do. I've got a life to live. The Girl with All the Gifts is interesting in its structure because when it first begins, it's quite trippy and strange and you don't know what's going on. You figure out what's going on pretty quickly. This book is just shy of 500 pages long, and about 50 pages in you figure out what's going on, so I'm happy to talk about that. And once you figure out what's going on, it goes from being a really strange mystery thing to being a pretty clear-cut, post-apocalyptic sci-fi horror thing. And if you've read or watched or played any post-apocalyptic media, you'll be familiar with the tropes and what's going on here, but this book really, in true Mike Carey fashion, does some really fun and experimental and clever narrative, psychological and thematic things with that setting, trope and context. What's also interesting is that I used to live in a small town in Hertfordshire just outside of Cambridge, and I'm pretty sure this book is set exactly there because all of the towns around it get mentioned a lot, and it was really weird hearing the names of tiny little towns in Hertfordshire that most people are not going to know of, like Baldock. And I was like, oh, that's in here. They passed through Stevenage at one point, and I was like, oh, okay, Stevenage is awful. Sorry if you live there. And it was funny to see Hertfordshire get referenced so much in the book. We begin, however, in an underground bunker-style place on a military base. We figure out quickly that there has been some sort of apocalypse. You have a small percentage of humanity left, and our protagonist is a young 10-ish-year-old girl called Melanie. Melanie is the titular girl with all the gifts. She lives in a jail cell, and every day she's taken out of that cell and put in a classroom with other kids, but before she's removed from her cell, she's strapped into a wheelchair where she can't even turn her head. She's strapped in almost entirely, as if she's extremely dangerous. They strap her into a wheelchair and wheel her and all the other kids into a classroom. There's a range of different teachers that teach different things, and she's taken a huge liking to one teacher in particular. And Melanie is bright. She's learning a lot, she's very savvy, she retains information brilliantly, and she doesn't understand why she's treated the way that she is. She only remembers the cell and the classroom. You have the teachers, most of whom are pretty nice, but especially Miss Justino. It's French, I'm not sure that's how you pronounce it. And then you've got this really stereotypical macho military guy. I was picturing the villain guy from the first Avatar movie. I was just picturing him. He's a gruff military sergeant. His name is Parks. You've got him, you've got the teacher, you've got Melanie, and you've also got a scientist woman as well, who is doing experiments on these kids, but you're not really sure what they are. So all you know at the beginning is that there's this bunker, it's on a military base, and Melanie gets strapped to a wheelchair and taught things in a classroom. There's a lot of mystery at the beginning, and it gets revealed pretty quickly. This is not a book that slowly cherry picks information or teases things at you. No. You start off clueless, you get your clues, and then the story moves on. About a quarter of the way through, they leave the military base, and the rest of the book is, as I've already alluded to, a journey south from the Cambridge-ish area of England, down south through London to get to somewhere, a stronghold, a city, something that remains of humanity. So while you do start off clueless, you learn a lot very, very quickly. That means that what I'm doing here is spoiling things. If you really care about spoilers, if you wanted to go in blind, I've kind of already fucked that up for you. Sorry. But if you don't want to know any more, close the video. Bye-bye. I'm not going to spoil anything that I consider a spoiler, and there are things that do get revealed later on. There are still twists and turns. But the main focus of this post-apocalyptic world is revealed before the 100-page mark of a 500-page book. So, you know, calm down if you're getting annoyed about spoilers. You're probably not. My audience is lovely. So I'm going to talk about why Melanie is strapped to a chair and why everyone seems afraid of her, which again is something that gets revealed pretty quickly. Melanie is one of the infected. The apocalypse that happened was exactly like the one in The Last of Us video games, if you've played those, and obviously there's now a TV show which I still haven't watched, even though I'm very excited to watch it. And it really is the exact same thing. You've got, I think they're called cordyceps, these fungus-type things that actually exist in the real world that infect the brains and bodies of certain insects, take over their brains, cause the insects to die and turn into kind of zombies. The little fungus guides the insect to a certain point, like a high point on a branch or a tree or something, and that allows it to then sprout and create spores, and as it goes on, that's its reproductive cycle, is taking control of, killing from the inside an insect, and then controlling its body to make sure that it can go on reproducing. It's gnarly, awesome, and brilliant. And this book, as well as The Last of Us, take that to a logical horror conclusion, which is, what if this fungus started infecting human beings and turned us into zombies? That's what happens here. The world fell apart because there was a pandemic of sorts of these spores that infected people, spread across humanity, and now you've only got a few people left. The reason Melanie and the other children are basically test subjects is that they are infected, but they're not acting like zombies. And so they're being taught things, they're being partially treated like children, in the sense that the teachers are nice to them and they learn things, but they're also treated like test subjects because they are. Most of the people on this military base see Melanie as someone who is already dead. Melanie died, and the fungus that's inside of her, that's controlling her, is the thing that's talking, the thing that's feeling, the thing that's learning, surely. Because the girl must be dead. The fungus has taken control of her. And the only way you know that is that these children do not need to eat or drink water or I think even sleep. They get all of the nutrients they need from a bowl of grubs, like maggots, that they eat once a week. And that gives them all of the nutrients they need, including water. But the humans also have to protect themselves by hiding their hormones and pheromones, etc. And so they take a medicine called E-blockers. I don't think it's an estrogen blocker, I'm not sure what it is, but it's a thing that dulls your scent, because if you don't wear that perfume or take that medicine, the kids turn ravenous and monstrous and start snapping and biting at you hungrily. They lose control of their inhibitions and they get aggressive. And that includes Melanie. So these kids represent a new form of infected. You've got, on the surface, the majority of the population of Britain, ravenous, zombie-like monsters spreading this fungus into the air. You've got a small percentage of ordinary, still alive people trying to survive in these bunkers and military bases, and you've got these children, who are something else. As you can see based on what I've told you, this book doesn't do much new in terms of the zombie apocalypse style, post-apocalyptic science fiction horror blend of genres. We've seen similar things in films, video games, TV shows, and books. But it's what M.R. Carey does with his setting and his characters and everything else. There's nothing wrong with not reinventing the wheel when it comes to a narrative style, a genre, a setting, a theme, whatever. As long as you're doing something new within those constraints, and Carey definitely is. What he's done here is examine what diseases mean, what mutation means, what adaptation means, what evolution means, and how it affects us in multiple different ways. He's looking at the attitudes of these people, the military guy, the doctor, the teacher, all kind of stereotypes of jobs and personalities. They're relatively two-dimensional people, but he's looking at their attitudes as part of a whole, as part of a grander theme, as part of the human narrative as opposed to the narrative of the story itself. There's a lot of curiosity in this book. At times it feels like M.R. Carey was using the narrative of this novel to explore his own curiosity when it comes to both science and our relationship to it as human beings. How do we relate to things like evolution, to science experiments, to the ethics and morality behind those things, especially experiments on humans? And does our job, does our relationship, does our background, does our childhood, all these things, do they impact the way that we relate to science and the boundaries that it pushes and the ways it has to adapt and the ways that scientists have to continue to study and invent and learn and reevaluate? All of this is explored by a scientist, a military guy, and a teacher. And most importantly, a fucking child, a vulnerable young girl, in amongst other vulnerable children. When the story begins, we only get Melanie's perspective, which I think is really smart because it establishes her, it makes us care about her, and empathize with her above all else. Whatever happens in this novel now, to Melanie, or whatever Melanie does, and a lot happens, it's nearly 500 pages long, we are connected to Melanie. We empathize with her, we care about her, we worry about her, we're curious about her, we are bonded with her. And I think that's so important, to focus for the first few dozen pages on Melanie and nothing else. Let's bond with her first. Carey sets out to do that, because that is part of his theme, and I can't really talk about that. That would be spoiling things. But thematically and philosophically, he wants us to bond with Melanie. That's what's really important here. And we do that. Then we bond with Miss Justino and Parks later on, and the scientist whose name I've forgotten. I could check. I'm not going to. Caldwell something. The bond between the audience and the characters, especially Melanie, and the bonds between the characters themselves within the narrative are what's really important here. The bonds are attached to the themes, to the tropes, to the genre and the setting. All of these things are connected to the characters. The bond between them is what matters, and the way that they make us feel as readers is also what matters. There is an incredible strength to that. And just like with The Last of Us, actually, what sets this apart from so much other post-apocalyptic fiction, it's that human connection that makes them stand out. It's what really makes it important here. The relationship between Joel and Ellie in The Last of Us is what everyone remembers, it's what everyone cares about, and the same is true here. That video game, however, while I'm comparing them, even though you don't really need to, that game focused on their relationship and what their relationship reflected of them as individuals, especially Joel. This is really a story of Joel and his redemption or failure at redemption, and it's fascinating. It's a great game. It's a good narrative. This, however, is, I guess, less cynical and less about individuals and rather about the unified whole of humanity. It is almost like a social experiment rather than a science experiment. This is a book that examines our relationships on a broader scale, looking after one another, supporting each other, teaching each other, showing each other empathy, and again, teaching each other empathy. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. That's ultimately what this book feels like it's about. It's about bonding with people, overlooking your differences, trying to figure each other out, and realizing that understanding each other, figuring each other out, empathizing with each other, and learning to do that in the first place ultimately is for the greater good. And as someone who believes in all of that, implicitly, I love this book. Absolutely to pieces. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week. This recommendation comes from Rachel, and the book is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. It's a gothic horror novel, good, that pays homage to Rebecca and The Haunting of Hill House while still being its own story. It takes place in Mexico after the Mexican War of Independence, and it's about a young woman named Beatrice who marries a wealthy widower after her father is executed and her home is destroyed. Soon after she moves in, her husband leaves to work in the capital, and while she's alone with her servants and her sister-in-law, strange and frightening things happen. And when she turns to the church for help, she meets Padre Andre, who reveals himself as a witch and decides to help her with her haunting. As they get to know each other more, they start to fall in love, so there is some forbidden romance as well. The book touches on issues of classism, racism, and sexism like a lot of Gothic novels do. Also, in an interview on the podcast She Wore Black, Isabel Cañas said that she was frustrated at how passive the protagonist in Rebecca was, so she decided that Beatrice fights back at the haunting in her home. I'm gonna go buy and read this book right now. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. Okay, while I go and buy and read that book, I need you to go and buy and read this or get it out of the library. Go, 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 unless you've already read it, in which, well done, and probably thank you for the recommendation. This is absolutely wonderful. Subscribe for books.